You can have your ad played here at OppermanReport.com every Friday night, 5 p.m., and Saturday night, 5 p.m. to 7 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And on Friday nights, too, we do a live portion for 1 hour that I just do a live monologue. The ads are very, very inexpensive, and they're also played in the Opperman Report member section. In the member section, you can find all kinds of exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. It's as cheap as $6 a month, $20 a quarter, or $75 for a year. If you contact me directly at oppermanreport@gmail.com, I'll set you up with a little special deal there where you get a discount if you PayPal me directly, and you even get a copy of my book. I want to thank Sean Duff from strawman.com. He runs the website. He runs the member section. And I also want to thank William Ramsey, who helps us to produce the show and book guests. You can find Sean Duff at strawmanmusic.com. He's an excellent musician. You can find William Ramsey, who's an excellent author, at William Ramsey Investigates on YouTube.
Oh, God.
There was another one. We just saw another one. We just saw another one apparently go. Another plane just flew into the second tower. This has to be deliberate, folks. We just saw on live television as a second plane flew into the second tower of the World Trade Center. Now, given what has been going on around the world, some of the key suspects come to mind: Osama bin Laden. Who knows what?
This is the horror we all saw and heard on September 11, 2001. The most despicable, brutal, savage crime committed in America, probably more so than even the murder of President John F. Kennedy. President Kennedy's murder resulted in a foreign policy reversal that in turn resulted in the needless deaths of 53,000 American soldiers and hundreds of thousands of women and children with that illegal invasion of Vietnam. 9/11 resulted in one more lying foreign policy disaster with the illegal shock and awe invasion of Iraq, destroying a centuries-old culture, 500,000 innocent civilians, and thousands of our own soldiers, many of whom now kill themselves. The Kennedy assassination also resulted in a pathetic, pseudo-legal sham of an investigation cover-up called the Warren Commission. 9/11 resulted in an even more pathetic attempt to hide the truth. You heard it. Not 4 minutes after the attack, without informing facts or even the hint of a start of an investigation, we hear the media telling us it was Osama bin Laden. This special 2-hour program with me, your host, John Barbour, has nothing to do with who did it, but everything to do with how it was done. And let me warn you right now, to paraphrase Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, if you can't handle the truth, you better tune out now and re-stick your head in the sand. As Betty Davis said in All About Eve, ladies and gentlemen, fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy ride. Before I introduce a dedicated scientist, teacher, researcher, and American treasure who has written what other scientists have called the most important book of the last 100 years, Where Did the Towers Go?, I'm just going to give you a few of my thoughts about humanity and about people. Mark Twain said, the more I know about people, the more I like my dog. When I was a neglected kid, I was surprised when people were evil. Now that I'm older, I'm surprised when they're good. I am no longer shocked at the depths to which humans sink to murder other humans. From Cain and Abel, mankind's humanity hasn't grown an inch. Only their technology, a technology that allows them to kill even more of their kind every single century. In World War II, boxcars dumping human cargo into ovens. America vaporizing thousands of Japanese, not with just one unnecessary A-bomb, but two. Agent Orange melting the flesh off of the Vietnamese. Depleted uranium still contaminating the earth in Iraq and Palestine. Do you realize governments give hundreds of medals for war, but there's only one peace prize? As Donald Trump and Edward Snowden have shown us recently, America is now a country where liars run for office and truth-tellers run for their lives. For mankind, it's always been so. Just ask Galileo. An ancient proverb says, if you're going to tell the truth, you'd better have one foot in the stirrup. Well, tonight, folks, this afternoon, for 2 uninterrupted hours, we are going to hear mind-blowing, mind-expanding truths. And I must tell you very honestly, when I first read Where Did the Towers Go?, I had a very, very difficult time letting go of what I thought might have been the cause of the collapse. Certainly it wasn't the planes. But each page of the 22 spectacular chapters convinced me more and more. I didn't understand all the mathematical formulae and charts, but the writing is so clean and clear, I could absorb it all. Each chapter is filled with telling evidence, photographs, unbelievable eyewitness testimony, and each concludes with common sense facts, material you've never seen or heard. Now you're going to hear it from a woman I've wanted to talk to for years. She has a PhD in material engineering science, a degree in civil engineering, and an MS in engineering mathematics. Jim Garrison was the only law enforcement officer in America to truly investigate President John F. Kennedy's murder. This woman is the only scientist in the world to investigate where did the towers go. Please welcome Dr. Judy Wood. Dr. Wood, thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me, and what a magnificent introduction, too.
Well, thank you, Dr. Wood. I am so staggered by the content of the information in your book, and what I would like to do, because it's so well crafted from the first chapter, even the preface and the introduction to the last chapter, that for these next 2 hours, we're going to begin it at the beginning and go through each one of them with the telling points. But I want to get to more than the beginning of the book so that I and those of us listening can understand more about the scientist and the woman to whom we speak and to whom we listen. What were your beginnings like? Where were you born? What was your family like? Where did you go to school, and why did you decide to become a scientist?
Well, I just decide what I'm going to do whenever I get to a fork in the road and just follow that route, and this is where I ended up.
Where were you born? Where were you born, Dr. Wood?
I was born in Maine.
And your family?
And they're still have a place up there. You can actually go home again.
And were they? You have siblings, brothers and sisters?
Well, my father's family is from the West Coast, and my mother's family is from the East Coast. And my siblings are all over the place now. But we still have the place in Maine. We can go back, for a family reunion, back to the tree you climbed on when you were 2 years old. It's kind of neat.
When you go back for these family reunions, considering what it is that you have done and what it is that you've risked with your book, what is the reaction from your family?
Well, it was different at first because people have been trained to believe what they see on TV. And if it's important, we'll hear about it on the evening news. That kind of mentality. But as things began to happen, like I'm so lucky that my father was able to read my book. At first, I had a contract with a publisher, but then the publisher refused to publish it and also refused to let me out of the contract. And not knowing how much time was going to run out, I wanted my dad to read it before he couldn't. And you never know when it's too late. And so I printed the book out with my inkjet printer and sent it to him. And the notes he sent me as he read it are just priceless.
Oh, how wonderful. Now, okay, so
and at first they began, very sort of antagonistically, but then it turned around to, first he said, well, do you have permission to use all these photos? And then he said, oh, I realize they want you to use these photos, the photographers. And then it got to the chapter 7, and he says, well, I guess you had to cover that. And then pretty soon, well, Congress needs to know about this. You need to tell Congress about this. And then a few chapters later, I think Congress already knows about this. And then a few chapters later, we're in a heap of trouble. But he's been an historian his whole life. That's been his area is political science and education. He was the dean of a college. He's administrator, but never anything in engineering. He learned how to step around the equations. But what he came away from this saying that no event in history has probably been so well documented.
How did you become interested in engineering since your father was in political science?
It was just kind of came naturally. My first toy was a Chatty Cathy doll. It was in the trash. Somebody threw it away, because it didn't work. So I couldn't make it any worse. I wouldn't get in trouble for taking it apart. And I took it apart. Would you believe there's a record in there? A little bright yellow record with little stylus that had come off. I put it back on there. It worked again. Hey, this is fun. I can make things work again.
That's wonderful. Where were you teaching? And
I was teaching at Clemson University.
When this happened?
Yeah, when 9/11 on that event.
Tell me exactly where you were, how you saw it, and what were your initial thoughts?
Well, initially I was at home because I taught an evening class on Tuesdays, a graduate class, and just to make sure, I would sleep in just to make sure I got up in time. I had my radio kick on and to an obnoxious radio station, so I was sure to get up. But I was up before then in a different room doing something on the computer, and the radio kicked on, and these characters were talking like it was a sick joke they were telling about somebody who was drunk from the party the night before, and he made a wrong turn into the building, ha, ha, ha. And it was like a joke, but where's the punchline? It was like a sick joke. And it went on, and finally I went and turned on the TV set. I still had one at that time just for cases like this, in case I needed to turn one on. And it was the same thing on every channel. That hit me. That was weird. It was the same show on every channel. It was weird.
It's interesting you noticed that because, I came out of news myself. And when it happened, I tuned from CNN to CBS, ABC, and I was staggered that there were no other shots except the same shot.
Right, it's the same thing and basically the same, verbiage. And that's when I really got suspicious. And so they say the Pentagon got hit. Well, my parents live near the Pentagon. I need more data. I'm one who needs data. So I call up my mom, and she didn't know about anything, so she looked out the window and didn't see any fighter jets, so she now was skeptical too. At that time, my dad was out in his garden, and he had a totally different experience. It was how you introduced to it, I think, that really had an impact.
Well,
he had a neighbor come running over, who worked at the Pentagon. It turns out she wasn't working at the Pentagon that day. She was at a meeting across town, but he believed, from what she said, that she saw the wing of the airplane take the roof off the Pentagon. And that's what he heard, and it was so deeply ingrained in his mind. It was just etched in there at the deepest level. And is an important fact to note, that this was an attack on human consciousness. It shut down people's ability to think.
Expand on that, an attack on human consciousness.
Well, let me continue on. So I went into campus, and first person I ran into was my graduate student, who said, Dr. Wood, what's Al-Qaeda? Who's bin Laden? This is before noon. And like, this blew me away. And then I ran into a couple of faculty members who mentally had a pitchfork in hand, and they're ready to go get the bad guy. We got to take him out. We got to take them all out. And it was, they were programmed to be in revenge mode, not to stop and see what had happened, but you got to go get somebody.
I was startled in the preface to your book. Even, I mean, every page has such terrific information,
and then I watched the buildings. I went to the faculty conference room, saw the buildings turning into dust in midair, and at this point I was thinking this was a War of the Worlds on TV, and I kind of looked. I didn't say anything, but I had this look on my face, pointing at the TV, like, you guys aren't buying this, are you? I mean, these are mechanical engineering professors, and they couldn't be hoodwinked into buying that. That's not
I mentioned the Warren report, which was a fraud, but I was startled even in the preface of your book when you said that NIST, N-I-S-T, and you'll have to tell us what those initials
National Institute of Standards and Technology.
Okay, they were supposed to have conducted the investigation, and you say in your book that they admit that their investigation was a fraud. This is in the preface. Mm-hmm.
Yes, they were mandated by Congress to determine why and how the buildings, quote, collapsed, unquote. And the first thing when I submitted my request for corrections to them was, you got to change the title of this, because the title was something like the final report on the collapse of. And then I said, well, this diagram you have, this building, the tipping top of Tower 2, it violates the conservation of angular momentum, violates the laws of physics. So your analysis, and then they said, oh no, it doesn't, our analysis doesn't violate the laws of physics because we didn't have an analysis. We didn't study what happened to the building. We just generated a hypothetical scenario.
Well, you quote a Dr. Reynolds in that preface who points that out. Tell me who Dr. Reynolds is, what he said, and why it wasn't information more widely disseminated.
Dr. Morgan Reynolds, I eventually became acquainted with, was obsessed about the airplanes. And fine, I know that the buildings most of the buildings turn into powder in midair, and airplanes don't do that. Real airplanes don't, and neither do fake airplanes. And the airplanes were a distraction. I called them the getaway car. It distracts people from what the main event was. But Dr. Morgan Reynolds was really hung up on the plane story. Okay. And what he, discovered is they just assumed there were airplanes. There was no evidence in the report of any airplanes. And so we kept our things separate. But still, when I submitted my Ketam case, that's a whistleblower case, they combined the two, and then the judge denigrated mine because of the airplane assumption. Well, mine had nothing to do with airplanes.
Well, there were numerous eyewitnesses on the street just shortly after it happened who said they didn't see airplanes that looked like airplanes. Some said they had no windows. Some said they looked like rockets. And you have another sort of interesting comic book analogy in there about this Roadrunner effect. Expand on that.
It's a cartoon I used to show my students when I teach them about shear stress, where Wile E. Coyote holds out a big Acme steel plate, and his Roadrunner's flying down the road, and then whoosh, something goes by, and he goes, what was that? And he looks at the steel plate, and it's a silhouette of passage of a Roadrunner. He goes, Roadrunner must have gone through here.
That's right.
And the same thing, was with the towers. You have this silhouette of passage of what looks like an airplane hole, must have been an airplane that hit the building.
But to this day, there are many people I know who have genius IQs, I hate to say it, who say, well, I saw the airplanes hit. But did they see airplanes hit?
Okay, here's where I want to break off into another a sub-discussion for a few minutes.
Certainly.
You know how you cover up irrefutable evidence?
Well, I've never had to, so I don't know.
Well, the easiest way to cover up irrefutable evidence is to refer to it as a theory, or a speculation, or ideas, or view. And then throw in lots of other kinds of speculation stirred around. Pretty soon nobody knows up from down. Or you associate it with something else, the person telling it. But there's this other thing that I spelled out in the preface of my book. It's important to first determine what happened. And only then can you determine how it happened. If you don't know what it was, how can you determine how it happened? And only then can you go after who and why. But, as you pointed out, before noon on 9/11, we were told who and why. Bin Laden, they hate us for our freedoms. Okay, but what was it that was done?
Is part of the it what you call the billiards ball of effect?
No. But the point here is that we first need to determine what happened before you can say how it happened or who did it. You have to determine what it is that happened.
Okay,
and
Doctor,
if you want to get cover up the facts, you get people to skip that first step. You get them to argue about how it happened or who did it. And then what they do is assume what happened. And so they're then solving an imaginary problem and not a real problem.
Okay, then.
And you can never, ever solve the real problem until you look at what happened, at the evidence. So the key to the cover-up is keep from looking at the evidence.
Hang on just a second. Okay, you have seen this, and almost immediately you know something is wrong. When did you begin your absolute serious research? How long did it take you to do that research and to write the book? What was the reaction at the university at which you were teaching and some of your associates?
Yeah, I started that day because there was a disconnect. Am I insane or is the rest of the world insane? To ask that question does not imply one's insanity. It's the opposite. What objective way can I use to determine what's going on here? Why are these people these people who should know better, they're sucked into thinking that a building turning to dust is a building collapsing, and we got to go get some, character that they named Bin Laden or whatever. So I went up to my office and made some calculations. Approximately how long it would take a billiard ball to fall off the roof of a building and have it hit the ground, and then if you had one floor fall and another floor and another floor. And I did these calculations. Well, gee, it takes a long time. Maybe it's like a minute and a half, floor by floor, and 30 seconds if it's 10 floors by 10 floors, with the assumptions I made. And so I'm thinking, maybe I have the coefficient of gravity wrong. I'm looking for every excuse in the book. So I get a physics book off my bookshelf and check the coefficient of gravity. Well, that's the same number I have. Oh, but maybe that was a typo, and I memorized a typo. So I get another book, and that's not going to solve it. They're all the same number. Okay, so I go through these calculations, and I do it with the analogy of a billiard ball. And I show it to a colleague, and they look at me like I'm having a senior moment because it's such simple equations. And that's completely correct. And then I show them applied to the towers, and then the numbers are all wrong.
Oh my.
In other words, it shuts off their brain. So that's where I learned the power of the billiard ball analogy, or the billiard ball example. It gets the brain moving without the emotional barrier.
I've always been under the impression, quite honestly, Dr. Wood, that people do not think, they just feel, and they just use their minds to justify their emotional makeup or their prejudice. But one of the most difficult chapters, of course, to look at is Chapter 3, entitled the jumpers. Was there something about the jumpers that reinforced in you the thought of what did happen?
Well, it wasn't reinforcing what did happen. I looked, and I strongly believe in this, to look at the evidence until you know what happened. You don't jump to conclusions, and that actually is a big key here. You know, it's very easy to make assumptions and to jump to conclusions. It takes great discipline to see only what is actually there and experience it to understand what that means. So we have all these people that believe they're experts because they have an opinion and an internet connection, but they don't have the experience to understand it. So being able to, and also the discipline to only see what is there. And so, you know, in a way, people were very brainwashed also. And that's why the chapters are in the order that they're in, because I first had to undo the brainwashing to get people to see what's happening.
That was a stroke of genius in doing that, quite honestly.
And the billiard ball example gets the brain working, and you see the official story doesn't work. That takes care of that. But then following that up with a jumper chapter, it isn't what you assumed it was either. You know, that's the effect of that. You look at it, and there's actually how this came about. A bunch of us were looking up, you know, through the first responder testimony to see how many people identified airplane parts, and we divvied out the different groups of, you know, of things. And I was going through mine. I got distracted by the first responders stepping around body parts, stepping over body parts. Ooh. And I asked the others if you know, their people saw body parts, and they didn't see it. They too had stepped around the body parts, reading it. It was, people had to tune it out because it was so unpleasant. So I started looking at it more carefully and realizing these aren't jumpers. There's something else going on here. You know, like, for example, you hit a deer going 80 miles an hour. The deer is almost surely dead, but the parts are basically in one place. It's all busted up. But you don't find a toe there, you know, an ear down there, a tooth there, you know, a rib over here. But what happened to the, quote, jumpers, what's referred to as the jumpers, is that they came apart to that level.
Oh my! How could bodies come apart?
Well, just take in the data instead of working on how it could have happened. Just, you know, think of the data itself and just collect that. And you keep collecting data. As I say, keep looking at the evidence until you know what happened. If you don't know what happened, keep looking at the evidence until you do, because the evidence will tell you what happened.
There was one prominent picture of a man in an orange suit that seemed to be flapping his arms like he was flying. What did that reveal to you as a scientist?
There's a lot of them that did that. If you are jumping out the window and have decided you're going to die, and you're going out the window, you're not flapping your wings. That reminds me of someone who went, whoa, how'd I get here? Like they accidentally ended up out there.
Oh, my. And then and the story of Jack Gentle talking about his wife.
Right, that she was they're starting down the stairs. She had her head wrapped in a towel that was saturated with water. And you know, she was going to call him on her cell phone when she got to the bottom, she and a friend. And a couple of stories later, she went out the window.
Well,
no intention of going out the window.
Why do you feel she had no intention of going out the window? Is that something?
Well, from what she said to her husband, you know, I'll call you when I get to the bottom.
Oh, I see. Well, if she went out of there unintentionally, could it have been because if there was an explosion next to her on the floor, or something else at work?
There's a lot of people seem to just go out the windows, and instead of jump to conclusions, just take that in that there's something weird going on. Something unexpected.
Well, a couple of the most telling photographs, and they seem to make such. There's some so the common sense of it is so obvious when it's explained and shown by you. And I'd seen some of those pictures 100 times and never thought about it. But you point out the distance from the building at which some of these jumpers are. And they might not be able to be that distance if they were jumping.
Yeah, like the world record for standing broad jump in the Olympics in 1908 maybe it was. That seems like a pretty good example of the type of footwear. Now they wear special footwear and warm up and whatnot, but back then a standing broad jump. Back then, that seems like it's a reasonable amount, but these people would have to be able to launch out of a window with that kind of oomph.
What about some of the people that, it's really a touchy, sensitive subject, but some of the people
that was a very difficult chapter to write because I didn't want to turn into a blood and guts chapter.
It's also a very difficult chapter to read and look at the pictures at the same time, but you're forcing us to look at the facts. Some of the people seem to be taking off their clothes at the windows. Why?
Right. There were some that were obviously without pants and some were obviously without shirts, hanging out the windows. And the one that got to me the most is the one who appears to be hanging from one hand and one foot, dangling there, taking off his pants. And that's the 105th floor.
Why would people be doing that in such a precarious position? What would tell them to do that?
I can only, obviously there's some reason that they would need to take the pants off outside the building, not inside. And so, I think of putting myself in that situation. And like Elaine Gentle, who went to the bathroom and got a towel wet and wrapped around her head, my first instinct would be to run to the bathroom before we lost water pressure, wet down my spare clothes I had at my desk, and then, wrap my head with it, and then, bolt for the door and try to get out.
As I recall, you mentioned something about how clothing is affected.
If you're wet from, wrapping yourself up in wet material, thinking that's going to help you against a fire, you'd be wet. And if the fire sprinklers came on, you'd be wet. And if it was hot in there and no fire sprinklers came on, you'd be sweating and you'd be wet. So it's a good chance you'd be wet. But also, you think of polyester clothing. I don't know what that does in different environments. But if there's something unique of that environment that made wet clothing unbearable.
What would have made wet clothing unbearable?
Well, this is just an example. This isn't proof of what happened. This is just a parallel example. You think of crowd control with active denial system.
Right.
And that, breaks up crowds by shooting microwaves at them. They can't it's just too painful. They have to, jump out of the way. And the only experience we each have with that type of thing is if you put your hand on the burner of a stove, you don't stop and say, maybe I should take my hand off the burner. No, by reflex, your hand flies off that burner.
Right.
If there's something in the environment, like microwave or some type of energy field that affects wet clothing differently than dry clothing, you'd be wanting to be out the window taking your wet clothes off.
Was this for you, Dr. Wood, the first hint that something other than bombs or explosives were involved in this? There might have been was this the first hint of maybe some kind of energy weapon?
Well, the first hint was that you don't have much rubble left. There's not much material left. It instead of the atoms being attracted to each other, it appears that they're repelling each other.
In Chapter 6, you talk about the seismic impact. That was truly, truly interesting because there is an article that you quote from the New York Times talking about the weight of these buildings. Expand on that.
Don't remember exactly which one you're talking about, but yeah, each building is about 500,000 tons. It's 500,000 tons, not pounds, tons, 500,000 tons each. And there was no S wave or P wave detected.
What is an S wave
events.
or P wave?
They're in a seismic event, like an earthquake. You first get a P wave, a pulse wave, a primary wave that arrives at the seismic station first, and then shortly after that you get the S wave, secondary wave or shear wave, that arrives there. And based on the lag time and knowing the material properties of the Earth, you can say how far away the epicenter was of that event. And I think most people have heard of that, because those two waves travel through the Earth, but travel at different speeds through the Earth. So one is slowed down more than the other one. And then there's a surface wave that also arrives, and based on the surface wave, they calculate the equivalent Richter scale reading, or the Richter scale reading for that. But
and
for
the Richter scale reading in this case was negligible, was it?
Well, it was essentially negligible for Building 6. It was a 0.6, and Building 7 is 6 times the potential energy of the Seattle Kingdom that was blown up, and that made a 2.3 on the Richter scale. And in Building 7 only made a 0.6. Now, each of the towers was approximately 30 times, that's 3 times 10, 30 times the potential energy of the Kingdom, but one made a 2.3 and one made a 2.1 on the Richter scale. That's equivalent to, everything turning to dust above the 20th floor and dropping only the bottom 16 or 20 stories, of that footprint to the ground to make a surface wave of that magnitude. But there was still no S wave or P wave detected.
The New York Times article that you reference in your book says it's a million tons of rubble, and then at the very end of this article, which sort of disappears, said what happened to the rubble. And also, evidently, there wasn't a lot of sound when the buildings came down.
Right. There's, well, let me read one of the quotes of a emergency medical technician, Michael Ober. It's on page 71. He said, "I don't remember the sound of the building hitting the ground. Somebody told me that it was measured on the Richter scale. I don't know how true that is. If the building is hitting the ground that hard, how do I not remember the sound of it?"
Wow. That's stunning. And your book is filled with these unbelievable quotes from people who were right
I wondered right that day, where's all the building gone? And then about 25 hours after the event, good. We now have some people asking about that. We had Peter Jennings in the studio and George Stephanopoulos at the site. Now, Peter Jennings asked George Stephanopoulos, "George, Jackie Judd and many others have been asking, where'd all the rubble go?" And George says, "Well, I've been asking people that, and one volunteer, Robert Gerlinski, explained it all fell down into the ground, was pulverized, evaporated."
Well, the first folks...
And just imagine, this is a newscaster who's there to tell people what happened, and that's the best he can do.
Well, there were some people initially who began to question. I mean, Hunter Thompson, the great gonzo journalist, the next day was on Australian radio, and he was saying this had to be an inside job. Now, we're not going to get into that, but...
Here, saying it's an inside job, that's saying who did it before you know what it was that was done.
That's exactly right. So now, some of those who began to question it, Dr. Wood, said, well, it looked like it was a controlled demolition. We see them all the time in buildings, controlled demolitions. But your book and that chapter just brilliantly refutes that. But then those who might argue with you would say, well, how do you explain those squibs of smoke that come bursting out of the side, which we can all see in photographs?
The squirts, I call them. There should have been a whole lot more if it was controlled demolition. A whole lot more. If you were going to squash that building down into its footprint in 8 seconds, or let's say 9.5 seconds, Let's use that time. That's slower than free fall, of the gravity speed. By the time you get to the bottom, just the average speed of the air squirting out there is like almost Mach 2.
Wow.
Out of each open orifice of the building, if every single window were open, that material is an awful lot of stuff in there. It's got to squirt out. So every single building around the perimeter, all the adjacent buildings should look machine gun fired.
Well, those folks who then bypass the business of controlled demolition say there are many nukes, and I hate to bring this up because this is a dog story in your book, but tell me about...
They say that they removed all the bomb-sniffing dogs. Well, there's a dog that was in the building when it blew up. When it dustified or whatever, during the building's demise, and the dogs, was killed in the building. So, how do you then, say there were no dogs? His name was Sirius.
The other thing that you point out very tellingly is that nukes explode.
Yeah, and there's something else about them too.
What's that?
Let's see if I can. I was trying to see if I can play it here for you. Blinded by the light. Remember that from Man for Man, Earthman? You think of a piece of evidence that was missing on 9/11. Who was blinded by the light? Nobody was blinded by light.
No, not at all.
Hot things glow. Nukes that are really hot, you're going to have all sorts of bright light, and you're going to have all sorts of heat. But you had 14 people trapped at the base of Stairway B. The picture on the cover of my book, they were in Stairway B when that picture was taken.
Oh, my.
And yet they walked out on their own.
Well, the next thing that some of these people who are trying to say that they came down mysteriously and not by planes, they talked about thermite. And
again, where's the blinding light?
And thermite,
you have to look at, first determine what was the destructive mechanism. We can rule out high heat. The buildings did not cook to death. The things did not burn up. The surrounding environment, paper didn't burn. Trees didn't burn. People walked out of there. People were, run over by the dust cloud rolling down the street. They were just left covered with dust. They didn't burn up. Matter of fact, they said the initial temperature of the dust cloud was cooler than ambient temperature.
And you point out the number of toilets in the building, none was found?
Yeah, I haven't seen any evidence of any, or anything else.
3,000 toilets disappear, and there's only one filing cabinet left. Now, Chapter 8 is dustification. That material and the pictures are absolutely spellbinding, and they all speak for themselves. How did you come to that conclusion, and where did you get that phrase?
Well, being in the profession I was in, forensic engineering and science is my area of expertise. 40 years of experience in that, and being able to see. That's what I mean by experience being important to have, to be able to understand, to see what is there, not what you believe is there or what you think should be there. Is to be able to have a lot of discipline to just see what's there. And one of the things I would do in my regular work is, before I know what a phenomenon is, I give it a name, or I name my various specimens of a certain type. I call, there's one specimen, my favorite one, I call pothole, because when I polished the edge, it had these dips in it, and I had to figure out what those dips were from. But instead of immediately jumping to a name of a known phenomenon, I use these placeholders. And if you don't know what's happening with the building turning into dust in midair, it needs something to refer to it by, because if you call it vaporization, you're wrong. That implies high heat.
Oh.
If you say it's pulverization, you're wrong, because that implies kinetic energy of something banging on something. So if you use an inappropriate term, you're biasing your observations. Kind of like the haze, why I call it fumes. If you call it smoke, you're already assuming that fire is the cause. It goes right into your subconscious. So that's why I use these placeholder names. Not a word that's hard to remember or too weird, but I think dustification is pretty clear. That needs to be added to the dictionary now.
Two things that I found compelling, especially, were your observations about what was called a bathtub. I don't even know where that word came from. I don't even know what it means until I read your book. I've never read about this bathtub anyplace else. And that is accompanied by these unbelievable pictures in this chapter that you have called Holes. So tell us what a bathtub is, what happened or didn't happen to that bathtub, and then expand on that into these mysterious holes in the ground.
Well, the buildings were built on bedrock that's about 70 feet below the water table in the Hudson River.
So
Manhattan is...
Their foundations are below sea level, in other words?
Right. And Manhattan, real estate in Manhattan's pretty expensive. So it's nice to make more of it. So they built out into the river, and so they built these dikes around where the base was going to go. And made the walls. They call them slurry walls because of the technique they used to make the walls. And they used these tiebacks and so forth. But once they got the insides in the bathtub, sort of the reverse of a bathtub, the cold keeps the water out, that kind of helps stabilize it as well. And so there's this delicate kind of dike all around the base of these buildings. That's towers 1, 2, 3, and building 6. Something that a lot of people don't realize, there were 4 towers destroyed that day. 7 buildings altogether were destroyed that day.
Well,
building 3 is a tower.
Just the 2 towers themselves, 1 million tons of concrete and steel. If that collapses, wouldn't it absolutely have ruptured these dikes around that bathtub?
Oh, for sure. As a matter of fact, the little scrap of building 6 that remained, which is an 8-story building, there's a little section of it next to the bathtub wall. They didn't want to take it down with sticks of dynamite for fear of damaging the bathtub wall, so they pulled it down with cables.
Then why wasn't the bathtub wall destroyed when this fell?
If it didn't fall, then it wouldn't destroy the bathtub wall. If the bathtub wall wasn't destroyed, you have to start asking if something fell on it.
Well, this leads one to speculate, Dr. Wood, and I know we're not into speculation. This is the speculation. If you are a terrorist and you want to attack the United States of America to destroy the Empire City, the financial...
If you want to create a lot of destruction, you tip over the buildings.
You would not only tip over the buildings, you would destroy that bathtub. So that leads one to conclude that whoever did this absolutely knew what they were doing. Now...
Well, that's clear, but you don't know what their objective was. And only now am I beginning to understand what their objective was. But I haven't for all this time because I've just been focusing on the evidence. And remember, I say keep sitting there until the evidence comes to you. Don't force it anywhere.
Okay, I'm not going to.
And eventually it does come to you.
Okay,
as you get more pieces.
Before we get to that, and we may get to that a little later, the business of the holes. What created these holes? Why are they so massive and in some cases so deep?
What we do know is there are holes, and they're for the most part empty, like the middle of building 6. Approximately a big, circular area, cylindrical area, which is a whole lot of smaller vertical cylindrical cutouts that sort of coalesce. It looked like a big cookie cutter, went to it, which we know wasn't used. I've actually had opposition people say, "Oh, she claims a cookie cutter cut out." No, but it is that type of thing where it's just something that's missing, missing voids that are cylindrical in shape. And the smaller ones, there's about a bunch of 24-foot diameter ones, and there's a variety of them. But what we do know is they appear very vertical, and they only go a certain distance, and they need to stop. Like Building 6 was 8-story building above ground level, and you can count from the picture inside the hole 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So you're standing at ground level. It didn't go below ground level. Later on, you see the picture of the parking garage. That was still pretty much intact there. A little bit could be busted up here or there, but it didn't go to China. It wasn't like infinitely deep. It went pretty much to the ground. Then the one over into the base of Building 2 that you see on page 211, that one goes down. It appears down at the bedrock, but they're walking through puddles of water. So
what could have created these holes? It certainly wasn't the collapse, because there didn't seem to be enough weight to create such a hole.
But it's also, if something fell in it, where is the stuff that fell in it?
Exactly.
It's empty. But that's what we do know is it's empty.
When you saw these holes and investigate them, what did that lead you to conclude about their appearance?
That there's something that caused material to go missing, or to get dustified in these odd shapes. It's really tough to not jump to conclusions, but what we can do is look at parallel evidence, how you can recreate the same effect in a lab. That doesn't prove that that's what did this, but it shows that gives you a good idea of a mechanism that can do that.
Okay, now let's get to Chapter 11, the business about the cars. That is so fascinating.
And what I mean by toasted cars, they're toast. They're history. Beyond repair, you got to get another one. You've heard that.
If there was no heat in the building, so to say, how could these cars be toasted from so far away?
Well, it's just a piece of data that we notice. We can start noticing patterns. For example, they're up on rubber tires. If there's a certain charge in the environment, the car might, build up more of that charge and not be able to discharge it fast enough if it's not grounded very well.
Some of the cars, how far were some of these cars away that would have made it impossible for them to be in this kind of condition?
Well, there's this big toasted car park, big parking lot that's about 800 feet away, with a sea of unburned paper in between, and the cars were seen to appear to go into spontaneous combustion. There's also some cars on FDR Drive that were seen by first responders. This one guy was trying to figure out. If people tend to want to jump to a conclusion to explain something. And the only explanation he could come up with was that a fireball must have rolled down, from the towers, must have rolled down to where he was in FDR Drive and hit the car, because why else did it go into spontaneous combustion? That was Alan Cook. There were some other cars that were seen there. I don't know where they were toasted, but I do know where some of them were toasted. And there's one particular one, it's on page 214. If you had a rip-roaring fire, a conventional fire going on in that car, those police lights, polycarbonate on top of the hood, the roof of the car, they would have been melted if they're on a hot grill.
Did any other scientists besides you investigate this and begin to question this? Or were you doing this all by yourself?
Pretty much by myself. There's a few friends who have helped me and been in support of me. Andrew Johnson, Russ Gerst, and Morgan Reynolds, of course. he was a good sounding block. I would say, Morgan, where'd the building go? Is it hiding under that hubcap across the street? It's so ridiculous.
You have testimony also from people who seem to be a half a block away, who are somehow picked up and thrown around.
Right. It's as though they were lifted by something. And there's a video of that as well. And they obviously weren't burned by anything. They weren't blown over.
You have a number of pictures of, you have a man in a business suit carrying his valise and others walking down the street totally. They look like mummies. They're absolutely covered in dust. And yet they don't seem to be harmed. They're just covered with dust.
Well, we don't know where they're hiding. Yeah, there's a place they're hiding. Oh, you're talking about the people, covered with dust. There's the picture of the three people, and the guy on the right, you can see where he had his tie tucked in.
Yes.
Because there's no dust there. It's a clean part of his shirt.
Oh, my.
So the dust cloud, went over these people and just left them covered with dust. Yeah, they have trouble breathing, and some describe sticking their face in the armpit of their shirt and using their shirt as an air filter. But they didn't get burned.
In chapter 12, what you call tortilla chips, you have a fascinating way of describing things that makes you want to read it, and then you read it.
But yeah, they're tortilla chips. It's like that became like a placeholder of that phenomenon, that things were just kind of withered down to very a big steel beam being like a tortilla chip.
Just all twisted and turned like somebody tied it into a knot or bent it.
Or being, sort of like the rest had turned to dust and blew away, and just not much left. Just withered away to nothing.
And the weird fires that seem to be popping up. Expand on that.
Yeah, in keeping with my naming of things, I could not call it a fire. It's not a conventional fire, at least not initially. So using the term weird fire at least saves you from falling into that rut. It could be a cold fire. Who knows what it is? It appears to be a fire. It could be plasma. We don't know what it was. We weren't there, but it wasn't a conventional fire. You see it sitting on a piece of paper, and the paper's not burning. Just like you see material glowing. And I use my famous phrase, hot things glow, but not everything that glows is hot. And I use the example of an incandescent light and a fluorescent light. No, I'm not saying the tower was built out of incandescent lights. But using that as an example, one is hot, one's not, but they both produce light. They both glow. So it's a different phenomenon. So these weird fires, it's the cooler version phenomenon. It's like a fluorescent light compared to an incandescent light.
Your chapter on the dust cloud. Tell me about that. I mean, because you did talk about the dustification earlier, and yet the dust cloud chapter expands and elaborates on that a little more. So could you do that for us?
Well, everyone's kind of familiar with seeing this dust cloud rolling out, but they just move on from there. They don't stop and look and say, that's weird, and look at it more carefully. Like it rolls out a particular distance and then stops rolling out and goes up, as though a process in it has changed with time or distance. And if you'll notice, the North Tower, the South Tower dustifies first, and the dust cloud rolls a certain amount north, and stops. And then when the North Tower dustifies, it rolls that distance, passes that, and goes one block further. Well, the towers are one block apart, so it rolls one block further, which is interesting.
That leads me to sort of jump 2 or 3 chapters, and I'll get back to those, because I'm talking about the dust clouds moving in a certain direction and stopping. You have a fascinating...
But then it goes up, which gets interesting. But the pictures on page 305, this was another clincher, the tipping top of Tower 2. That was one of the things that fascinated me from the beginning, because people know this in physics. If you have a rigid body and it starts tipping, without anything stopping it, it's going to keep on tipping due to laws of angular momentum.
Right.
Due to conservation of angular momentum, it's got to keep going, but it doesn't. That means that it's no longer a rigid body. If it turns to dust, all the little particles in it are still rotating. It's just not rotating as rigid body. So it does maintain the laws of angular momentum or conservation.
In other words, no heat generated by gasoline, airline fuel. No amount of heat could have done that to that tipping tower, right?
Well, this was nearly an hour later when the building went poof.
Okay, now this brings me to something that nobody talks about, and I'm stunned it's even a chapter in the book. It is the chapter on the hurricane that was just outside the edge of New York. Tell us about that hurricane, and why would it not have been reported on the weather report?
It was reported, but not so that anyone really remember it. It's just it was under-reported. As you know, that weather stations, they drool and salivate over weather events, and they name it, impending disaster station. Come see us, come tune into our station, and they just milk it for all they can because they get viewership. So you would think anything, faintly coming towards, this could be imagined to be coming towards New York City, they would want to exploit it.
Well, what is the significance of that hurricane as far as you're concerned as it relates to this event?
Well, I'm collecting data. I'm looking at data, and what I notice is for 4 days, it's making a beeline straight towards New York City, and it's not talked about much. Almost not at all. It's not zero report, but it's very underreported. And the text messaging that comes from the weather updates, they say, well, you think it's going to turn around today on the first day. Well, it didn't. On the second day, well, it's going to turn around today. And it didn't. And next day, it's going to turn around today. It didn't. And the fourth day, it's going to turn around today. Well, it's a good thing it did, because it's right on the edge of Long Island. And there was a high-pressure system moving eastward while the hurricane was moving westward. At some point, they were going to hit. But how did they know exactly where it was going to hit? So they didn't need to warn anybody. When Hurricane Rita went towards Houston, they gave a voluntary evacuation before it became mandatory to give some people a head start. Same with Hurricane Irene and Hurricane Bill. Those two were aimed towards New York. They give people, a running start. Now, Manhattan is at sea level, and it has a few million people there. How are you going to evacuate them in 1 hour if suddenly you realize you're wrong with predictions?
In reading that...
Unless you are 100% sure it's not something that's going to ever hit Manhattan, or it's not going to stall out there and you're not going to, have a big storm surge.
And the only way one could be assured that it was never going to hit is that it had to be engineered and controlled.
And somehow controlled. That leads to that conclusion.
It can only lead to that conclusion. And then also, I just wanted to absorb those fascinating facts. But when I got there, I thought, is this engineered hurricane somehow related to the events of 9/11?
Okay, after I got to that point, and actually how I discovered this, I wanted to see how far up that dust went, so I looked up some weather satellite images to see how far the dust could be seen. And then I went, what the heck is that? It's a hurricane. I didn't know about it. That's how I discovered it. And so then, realizing that how were they so sure exactly when it would turn around, where it was about the closest, and I'm talking about the outer bands, not the eye of it. The outer bands were the closest to Manhattan approximately at 8 a.m. on 9/11.
How did you then discover The iron particles in the air, and what is the significance of that discovery? What does it reveal to you?
Back to the hurricane. So now this is something weird. Now what do hurricanes do? And I start thinking about hurricanes, thinking about how something's going around, it's getting spun around, and if it's moist air is being spun around, you're going to have, it's sort of like a big Tesla coil. And then I start looking at the weather stations, and they report all around Manhattan, they reported thunder that day on 9/11. Birds know when a hurricane is coming. They feel the electrical system, the pressure changes, and they pack up and leave town. So
well, the reference to the Tesla coil is bringing us closer and closer to something that I really want to get into. But I want to
But see how I don't want to just jump to the conclusion, because some people want to argue about opinions.
Yes, I know exactly.
And so I'm just you're saying that it is a fact that was underreported. And it's a fact that you had dry thunder at these airports.
Okay, let's go back to chapter 16.5.
Okay.
Quote from Arthur Clarke, our 2001 genius writer, and it's called perceptual conformity. What is perceptual conformity?
Why don't you go ahead and read chapter 16.5? It's a nice intermission.
Okay,
that's what it's sort of there for. Oh, yeah, I think the story is very good. Go ahead and read it.
That's your job, Dr. Wood. You know what? Let me do something here so that I can get to that. Let me just take a very, very brief break. I'm going to speak to Don, the engineer. Don, I'm going to take the very brief regular break so I can get to that particular chapter. Then, when I want to come back, Dr. Wood, we're going to get into the Tesla-Hutchison effect and questions about this energy weapon that you say has to somehow be involved with this, and you don't know quite what it is. I have a ton of questions about that. So you think about that, love.
Okay, do we have just a minute to? And I'll say what the perceptual conformity chapter is about. It's when the first jet aircraft were being test driven. There's a P-59, and the P-59 pilots and the P-39 pilots which were propeller planes. The two pilots would meet at the local watering hole, and after downing a few drinks, the P-59 pilots, the jet engine ones, were bragging about flying a propellerless airplane. And the other guys didn't believe it. So the next day, the P-59 pilot put on a gorilla costume, a derby hat, and a cigar in his mouth and went up flying. And then made sure that when the other one saw him up flying and pulled up next to him and waved. And then at the watering hole said, "Hey, did you see the escaped gorilla from the zoo? Up flying an airplane." And the point being that people only see what they believe is possible.
Well, the point being also is... You have a wonderful quote, the quote from Arthur Clarke and others here, when Mark Twain says, when you begin to think like the majority, you better rethink what you're thinking, which is so true. Don, I'm gonna take this break now, because the stuff that's coming after the break is really mind-blowing. We'll be right back with Dr. Judy Wood and Where Did the Towers Go?
You're listening to BBS Radio. If it's not mainstream, it's on bbsradio.com.
Hi, I'm Richard Belzer. This is the great BBS Radio.
Thank you for that smile upon your face. Oh, sunny.
Hi, this is John Barbour. You may remember me as the co-host, producer, and creator of Real People, America's first reality show. or most recently as the writer-director of what's been called the definitive documentary on JFK's murder, The Last Word on the Assassination. Now I'm doing a show every other Monday from 5 to 6 Pacific Time on BBS. You'll hear provocative views, unreported news, and film reviews from me with outstanding guests and you. Join me on John Barbours World.
Those of you who have an ongoing interest in the JFK assassination might want to know about this. TV producer John Barbour. He put together a dream team of JFK researchers, including Coast regular Jim Mars and world-class JFK writers Dick Russell and Joan Mellon. They all got together at UNLV in front of a live audience. They had a screening of Barbour's terrific and I'd say historic film based on interviews with prosecutor Jim Garrison of New Orleans. And then after the film was shown, the experts all talked about the latest JFK theories and evidence. It's now out on a DVD. Terrific stuff. I'm George Knapp, Coast to Coast AM.
Welcome back. I would like to thank... what was that? I'd like to thank George Knapp for that wonderful unsolicited review. And folks, if you happen to go to Amazon, you'll see dozens of unsolicited reviews about that really, really important documentary with new material from Jim Garrison about how he tracked down the guy that gave Jack Ruby the orders to shoot Lee Harvey Oswald. And while you're up there, if you're looking for a smile or a thought or a homily or even something that'll make you angry, go to John Barbour's Facebook page, Uncensored Volume 1. It's sort of like chicken soup for the funny bone. Anyway, thank you again. Thank George for that. And again, I'm thanking Dr. Wood for being here and most importantly for writing this book that's been called the most important book of the last 100 years. Dr. Wood, let's get to what you call the Tesla-Hutchison effect, since you brought up the business about what appeared to be like a Tesla coil in that hurricane. And what were your thoughts? Were you reluctant to go into the areas that you were going? Could you imagine that people could build such a thing or use such a thing? Take us through this.
Well, with Tesla, as I say, there are stories we read about in books. He doesn't live now, in the here and now. So they're just, as far as we know, the stories we read in books. They say, see what you see. Don't make assumptions. And I don't know how to go back in time. So, okay, that's fine. But then there's somebody who does live in the here and now who replicates Tesla's work. Oh, I got to go visit this person. And so I did. It was John Hutchison.
How did you hear about him and how did you find him?
Well, after I had cataloged all the different phenomena I had seen around Manhattan, one night I happened to stumble upon a blog, and by golly, somebody had reproduced every single one of these effects.
Oh, my.
And then I contacted this person and sent him a photograph from the World Trade Center with this in front of WFC, that's World Financial Center, WFC1, where the double pane windows, one pane was missing but not the other. It had rounded holes. Had a vehicle parked in the right place but upside down. I don't know if you remember that picture. I sent him that one. I said, does your neighborhood ever get to looking like this?
That's funny.
And anyway, I went out to visit him, and I got to see things for myself, and I discovered some things about his samples that he didn't even know. And it was very instructive, and seeing is believing.
What was it you discovered that he didn't know? Because he must have been
about the magnetism, how that would be altered in his samples in the affected regions. Something that was not magnetic, where the affected area in the same, it was a solid cylinder, it was attracted to magnets.
I must tell you quite honestly, in the research that I did into John, and I found him very engaging. I found that his experiments and totally Buck Rogers fascinating, but I must tell you at the same time, I was still surprised he was alive, because I think a couple of times the Canadian government just broke into his labs and, like the FBI did when Tesla died, just confiscated everything. Where does John live, and what does he do now?
Do you remember that Helen Reddy song, Angie Baby?
Oh, yes.
There's a phrase from it that describes him well. It's so nice to be insane, no one asks you to explain. and like, I think Jesse Ventura interviewed John, and he said, "Yeah, why are you still alive?" And John looked at him with a grin on his face and said, "'Cause I'm a raving lunatic."
Oh, my. But he obviously is not. There's no question that somewhere around he has sort of absorbed some of Tesla's cosmic genes after Tesla departed, because his work is just spellbinding.
But on the internet, he's written off as a lunatic, and so that he's not a threat to the system, because the brain dead, can't think for themselves.
Okay,
and so
now
they don't find it.
This gets to you're going over there, and did John, when you showed him this and when you talked to him about the other things, the holes in the ground especially, did he confirm your feelings that maybe this was some kind of energy-directed weapon?
Now, I don't talk about weapons. Let's clarify. Let's clarify this.
Okay.
I talk about the destructive mechanism. We can
Okay.
rule out kinetic energy. Something banging on something. The building was not beaten to death, so
Right.
kinetic energy is ruled out as the destructive mechanism. The building wasn't cooked to death, so thermal energy as the destructive mechanism is ruled out. But what we do find is that energy was directed, instructed in some way to do something differently than it normally does, and I'm calling that directed energy.
I see.
Energy
Now,
was instructed. I'm not talking about a specific weapon. I'm talking about the destructive mechanism, the categories.
okay.
And so one way of covering up the evidence that I present is to say, oh, she's talking about laser beams from outer space. Well, no, laser beams, for example, would cause the destructive mechanism of thermal energy if they cook something, and I've ruled that out. So it's that the energy was directed in some way. Like, instead of atoms being attracted to each other, they're directed to repel each other.
This brings up the most secret weapon, and I hate to use the word weapon, but indeed it was a weapon, and you call it this.
It's a technology. Is
the Manhattan Project. They developed the A-bomb, and they tested it at White Sands. 5,000 people worked on that project for years, and not one word of it was leaked, except supposedly, they say, the Rosenbergs. They tested it at White Sands. Then they dropped it first on Hiroshima, and then Nagasaki, and then the world knew about it. And of course, people asked why the second bomb. The second bomb was to warn Russia, and the United States started the Cold War, because how else to bring 1.5 million men home to make toasters? You can't sell that many toasters, but you can always sell weapons. That is another story. But with this energy-directed device, which was used as a weapon, where could they develop and test this?
Well, there's a lot of places. I'm sure various countries have their own research labs too. But we had something called the Star Wars program.
Right.
That's actually their state objective, but we don't know what they're doing behind the closed doors. But how do you pull this off in broad daylight in front of the world and have so few people see what happened? And that's becomes the biggest key here is hiding this technology. They wanted to use it, but they kept it hidden from the consciousness of most people. And how they do that is people like to do groupthink. They like to join a consensus. So when you see a consensus like truth groups together, they're really being issued talking points and a list of things, and then they stop looking at evidence. And that's one of the key things. Anyone who's asking questions was then, herded into these truth groups.
And
Or
then
a consensus
re-educate.
panel a consensus panel is, defines what talking points you're to recite. And then
Okay,
everyone
now,
just recites. And I think the same thing was probably done with JFK. People
there's
don't like.
I must tell you, Judy, there's no question about that. When I first did the Garrison tapes, which won the San Sebastian Folk Festival Award, and I must say, quite honestly, it is a wonderful, brilliant, factual documentary, and it's a great story because it's a personal story, as is your story a great story because it is a personal story. I offered it to 12 of the leading assassination sites in this country, from JFK Lancer to all of them. I offered it to them 10 years ago free to put up on their sites to show all of their hundreds of thousands of subscribers this story of this wonderful man, the only guy to investigate this crime. And I must tell you, every single one of them turned me down, and a couple with very nasty letters. I must tell you, the CIA seems to be the only government outfit that knows how to do its job properly. In the 70s, the Church Committee revealed that they had 1,000 media assets, the CIA. Imagine what they have now when we're fighting fake wars in 2015.
And then most of the people following along are well-meaning people, but they just, go into groupthink, and they get controlled as part of a consensus.
This is what I'm trying to say to you. I am convinced that some of the leading advocates of a new investigation into the death of Kennedy are CIA assets.
Oh, right.
That's why nothing is being done.
Right, and think about with the parallel with 9/11. We need a new investigation. Why? Here is one. It's in my book. That is a comprehensive forensic investigation. Why are they covering it up?
I'm going to expand on that a little more. But the thing that impressed me when I looked at the holes in the ground, those holes in the ground could have only come from above.
Not necessarily.
Oh, okay, tell me why not necessarily.
Now think of, just imagine in space. Ignore all of the material, whether it's in or not in this zone. Make 2 points and draw a straight line between those 2 points. Let's say something happens that causes, at a radial distance from that line between those 2 points, all the material turns to dust. It's instructed in that region to dustify. And you see that same kind of thing in some of John Hutchison's samples. And it may be in a solid piece of aluminum where there's no way you can get a drill in there. And it's just, dustifies. And it may not necessarily be, from above. That's a tempting conclusion based on, preconceived ideas of what's possible. But what you can notice is it seems like a cylindrical cutout where materials, is dustified or missing.
But these energy-directed devices had to be somewhere.
Or okay, let's look at how John Hutchison's does his stuff. He creates a static field. He used to use a Tesla coil, but later used a Van de Graaff generator. Creates a static field, and then within that static field intersects various radio frequency signals, such as microwave. And depending on the wave shape, like square wave versus sinusoidal and so forth, and the relative magnitudes and directions and whatnot, you get different effects. Sometimes he gets stuff levitating, sometimes stuff disintegrates. And he said that was pointing out about that he gets stuff that's not grounded gets affected more because it has nowhere to discharge to. And you think of the toasted cars.
Well, also there's this famous clip on the internet about, I believe, the mayor of New York talking about Building 7, which is only hit by dust and by smoke. And that's the phrase that he's saying is, well, we told the firemen to pull it, which is used as an expression in the demolition industry. But you have this great photograph in your book of the rubble of Building 7. And right
There's not
across,
much left of that.
yeah, and then right across the street is this totally unharmed U.S. Post Office. In other words, the damage from
It didn't even completely spill across the street.
It didn't, not even a rock, not a boulder, not a brick.
Yeah, you think of all the windows in a 47-story building, and if you're going to do controlled demolition, you remove all material from the building, everything that's nailed down or not nailed down, everything goes, because a Coke bottle in the windowsill becomes a projectile, like a missile. Now think of all that glass. If it goes flying, you're going to have people decapitated. You're going to have trees sliced. Didn't happen. You couldn't even find the glass. Yeah, and the building across the street would have pockmarks all over it from being machine gun fired.
Well, it takes us back to what we said before, that if it were real terrorists who were trying to destroy America, they would have destroyed all the surrounding buildings. And this is a conclusion, but there's no other conclusion that you can reach, that the people who designed this attack had to be out of a James Bond movie, for crying out loud. They had to be total evil geniuses in order.
And there were very few that needed to be involved. Let's say there's only one person knows what the left hand and the right hand are doing, where neither the left hand nor the right hand knows what they are doing themselves. Let's say, for example, you're doing a military exercise. It's just an exercise where you're monkeying with the magnetic field in a certain region. All right, another military group is they're supposed to fiddle around with the electrical, environment in a particular place. Neither one knows what the other one's doing.
Exactly.
And somebody else is monkeying with the gravitational field, and voila, something, this happens. So you don't need that many people to know what they're doing. Somebody running a military exercise is, just doing their job, and they have no idea of what happened. But what is clear is that this technology must be kept secret at all costs.
Well,
and so you get this cover-up team saying, for people asking questions, you say, oh, it was thermite, or it was bombs in the building, or it was, you give somebody someplace else to go, so they quit asking questions. They quit
on the Manhattan
Manhattan
Project, 5,000 people were involved in it, and probably only a handful of people actually knew what they were doing. How many people would be involved in developing this kind of energy directing device?
I call it directed energy. Just energy that gets directed. This isn't something new. This is something that's been around for a while. John Hutchison didn't develop it. He just discovered it and could reproduce it. It was patented. A part of it was patented over 100 years ago. George Pigott, who was doing levitation.
Oh my goodness!
And that's in my book.
Yeah, I know it is. Also, there's again about like the chapter about the Hurricane Aaron was astonishing to me. There is another chapter which almost bordered on science fiction, but it's not science fiction. And I never read anything about. You always hear about the Earth's magnetic field, and you always hear that the poles are going to tip, and we're all going to fly off, and the Earth's going to. I never read any of that stuff, but I was fascinated by your chapter 19, which was the Earth's magnetic field. Why was that chapter included?
I just happened to look at it and think it's pretty strange that we had this anomalous signal that just perfectly lined up with each of the events that happened that day.
How do you mean?
For about 3 days beforehand, the signals are at 6 different stations are going along. Those are just the easiest ones to access. And then about 20 minutes before the North Tower got its hole, which was the first tower affected, they all started trending downward. And then there's a hole that happens, and then they start trending upward, and then a hole happens, and they go horizontally. And then, they start going down. That's when the South Tower went to dust, and then they really dropped off the cliff. That's when the North Tower turned to dust, and they're haywire all afternoon until Building 7, dustified, did its final demise. And then it's almost back to normal, but there's some sort of magnetic resonance that still kind of continued in there a little bit. But it's strange. All afternoon, they were haywire, and that's when Building 7 was turning to dust all afternoon.
Could this directed energy device have anything to do with the Earth's magnetic field?
Everything's, affects something else, but not necessarily the Earth. It could have been that it was recorded there.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, it was picked up, but those aren't satellite mounted. These are ground mounted.
Oh,
so
I see.
It was sensing that something was picked up on the magnetometers, that happened to coincide with each of these events. And it was interesting that 20 minutes before the North Tower got its holes, where they started trending off of where the average of where they'd been, and the NIST report, the seismic station, and I think the 9/11 Commission all report a slightly different time for when the North Tower got its hole. I won't say hit by a plane because I'm not making assumptions. When it got its plane-shaped hole, and I like to joke and say I can tell you which one's right.
Oh my.
Based on the magnetometers, it's between two of the three.
What do you mean by St. Elmo's fire?
It's a phenomenon that occurs inside tornadoes. Also you hear some pilots talking about the electrical signal, going over their airplane if they're flying through an electrical storm. But something quite interesting is that in our regular school books we don't talk about Tesla, in elementary school and high school. We don't talk about tornadoes. Tornadoes are left a myth, or it's just storytelling, which I find is really weird. In tornadoes, there's a strange phenomenon that does occur in tornadoes. Remember about 3 years ago in Dallas-Fort Worth area, there were flying trucks.
Yes.
Just the trailers, not the engine, not the tractor part, not the front of it, just the trailers. No, there were no dumpsters up flying around.
And why is that?
I can see a similarity there with trailers and trailer parks. You know how tornadoes like trailers?
Yes,
trailer parks?
Seem to be attracted to them.
The same as toasted cars on 9/11. They're up on the truck trailers were up on rubber tires. They could build up a charge faster than they could discharge it. And I think the same thing is true with trailer parks. They're not as well grounded as a house. They're
oh, I see. Dr.
So
Wood,
they can build up a charge faster. Yeah, and you get levitation is one of the things. That's not wind lifting up those trailers.
It's levitation, not wind.
Yep.
Okay.
And electricity, magnetism, and gravity are all different sides of the same coin.
Dr. Wood, how long did it take you to do all your research and publish your book? And you mentioned at the top of the show that your original publisher refused to publish it and wouldn't give you your rights back. How long did it take you to do this?
Well, eventually I got them back, and I wasn't going to trust another publisher, and so I published it on my own with the financial help of some friends. And I also sell it essentially at cost. It's an expensive book.
It is, and it's worth it, and I've already bought it for a few friends.
Great.
Right now, before I get into other important questions that I have, where can folks go to buy this book, and how much would it cost them?
It's on Amazon or on my website, wheredidthetowersgo.com, or on Amazon. You just look for Where Did the Towers Go, or look for my name, Dr. Judy Wood. There's and the price is about $40 plus shipping. And often Amazon gives free shipping, so the price looks like it's $45, but that's what it costs with shipping.
Well, I got mine at Amazon, and it got here within 4 or 5 days, which quite surprised me. And
Was it about that price, $45?
I paid $50, but I must tell you, I told you in an email earlier that I was going to buy it for $300 when I thought it was $300. It just
used ones are more expensive because they think that it's that's about the price of what a textbook would be. That's of that quality. But,
speaking of a textbook, is this book in any colleges or universities?
Oh no. It should be.
Yeah, no
because
question.
it's a course in critical thinking.
It's a course in critical thinking. It's a course in political history. It's a course in science. It's a course in almost everything. It is so American. Okay, now I want to get...
But if you want to cover this up, if you want to cover up what happened, you can't be doing that. What you do is anybody asking questions, you herd them into a group which is, poo-poos this.
Okay, now let's get to, Dr. Wood, let's get to this quickly. There's an organization called Pilots and Professionals for a New 911 Inquiry. If you Google that, you will see hundreds and hundreds of prominent politicians, architects and engineers and pilots and stewardesses asking for a new investigation. Then there are those who are involved with what they call the 911 Truth Movement. Why are they not holding up your book and applauding your work? And what was your reaction? Especially, I think the outfit that has most of the public's ear right now is architects and engineers for 911.
What I like to say is if they're, why are they calling for a new investigation? That what they're doing is admitting that they're incompetent to do on themselves. Because who's going to do it if it isn't engineers?
Oh my gosh! I never thought of that.
Yeah, it's.
You have already done the investigation for them,
right? And many have said that my book is like holy water. What you flick on somebody to see if they're a vampire or whatnot. and it is really true. Why would somebody who's claiming to head up a quote truth movement, unquote, why would they lie about my book?
Okay, tell me how they lie about your book. And I
it's about laser beams from outer space.
Okay, no, hold it a second, because I was stunned when I heard that Richard Gage sort of denigrates your book. I was furious about it, but because I had enormous respect for the fact that he was developing this outfit with 1,000 members.
Oh, that's what you see. You're led to believe that, but you never really see so much. It's an image thing, and so people line up behind it because they think it's going somewhere. But when that group first came to be, he came on the scene after I was already publishing my work, and his website went up. The AE 911 Truth website went up 3.5 weeks after I submitted my request for correction to NIST.
Oh my!
And as part of their screening process, they have this team that vets people, and anyone who has anything to do with the name Judy Wood they're rejected from the group.
Why?
It's the only thing I could conclude, except when I filed my federal QTAM case, they wanted to get this into court. Well, I did, but nobody supported it. Almost nobody. 5 or 10 people maybe who supported it. Well, no one in the truth movement supported it, and without that support, the judges were free to sweep it under the carpet. As a matter of fact, the Court of Appeals acknowledged, they were respectful, they acknowledged they were ignoring the law to dismiss the case.
Oh my goodness gracious.
The lower court judge said he wasn't going to hear a case about who shot JFK or what landed on the moon, and he also claimed I was saying there were bombs in the building, among other things. It was not about my case.
Do you teach at a university now?
No, not now. I left that environment to do this work because somebody needed to do it.
Wow, goodness gracious!
And if I hadn't done it, it wouldn't be done. That's clear.
I just a passing thought that I have. You know what? Dr. Wood? I almost called you Judy, forgive me. But I'll call you Dr. Wood because you are a teacher and you are a doctor, and I'm learning a lot, as we all are. This thought occurred to me as I held it in my hand, that there was a time in the world when people were moved by books. Of course, Karl Marx with Das Kapital, it started a revolution in China and Russia, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense started the American Revolution. Sinclair Lewis with The Jungle, he cleaned up the Chicago stockyards and cleaned up America's food. And then Rachel Carson's Silent Spring made us aware of the environment. Emile Zola, Jacques, freed a wrongly convicted Jewish army officer in France.
Books are important. Books are important.
But why is it we have this phenomenal book? Where did the towers go?
People prefer to be told their opinion. In a 5-minute YouTube video, they want to be told their opinion, and then they just repeat it over and over again. A lot of people have asked, will this ever be on an ebook or whatnot? And no, for several reasons. But one of the most important reasons is if you read the book, you will know why. And seeing my presentations, you don't get nearly what you get from the book. The book is a learning experience. In order to understand the material, you have to be deprogrammed to some extent to be able to see it. Otherwise, you just jump to the answer. You're arguing about your opinion about the answer without understanding how to look at things. Well, and it's vital that we learn how to look at things. So think about this. When you read the book, you're sitting on your sofa and you read a paragraph. You look off into space and you contemplate what you just read.
Yes.
You think about its implications. When you watch a video, you don't do that. When you scan on an electronic book, you don't do that.
That's true.
And this is vital for people to be able to think about things and to be able to contemplate what's going on in the world. And that is the difference. How did we get to where we are? It's because people have turned their thinking over to someone else's keeping. We need to take it back.
Well, my feeling is, and I hate to say it, the first most difficult thing to do is to get people to think. That probably won't happen. I don't know how the government did it or how the government engineered it, but they have dumbed down America beyond belief. And there is no longer any sense of community in this country as there was years ago. We had great labor movements. We had great social movements. We had great culture. They're all gone. They will never reappear. And we're each like a little island unto ourselves, sitting in front of the computer and reading all this interesting, fascinating stuff, but we have no sense of community by touching hands and holding hands and meeting with other people to take action. But you know what? And I will tell this to anybody, as great as the book is, if you're just one of these people who likes to go things like Twitter, that's something in 2 or 3 lines, and God, that's great, or I love this Mark Twain quote, or that Shakespeare quote about love. If you go to the back or the end of Dr. Wood's book, you can read 43 facts that are irrefutable. And if you don't believe and understand those facts, you must shoot yourself, because you're not worth being alive, honest to God. It is right there for you.
But we have a consensus group that has determined that she's full of it. Her space beams are full of it. What would you say to someone like that?
Well, there's no way that you can refute any of that stuff, because that is opinion. It is not fact. That is emotional. That is not intellectual. So you have to discard that. Now we're going to go back to something that you barely hinted on. And I would like to add something at this subject you just talked about, kind of a secret here, that what's going on in the world. Think of what defines a country. Borders.
Okay. Culture.
Yes.
Language.
Yes.
If you destroy those 3 things, the country is all done. So what does this, we're talking about destruction of the culture. And not reading books and not thinking, not interacting with others.
Well, fortunately for the 1% who own this country, I mean, the 1%, they elect the president, and they leave it to the 99% they select them, leave it to the rest of us to elect them like idiots. But they fortunately do not have to drop a bomb on the United States unless they were somehow involved with 911. They have done it. But they have done it to the rest of the world in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria.
We could do a whole other show on that. And 9/11 is the very foundation for all that is happening now. People don't see it because they're only used to seeing direct cause and effect. They're not used to putting together what the whole picture is about. And 9/11 was an attack on human consciousness and a type of brainwashing. And until you get rid of that brainwashing, people's brains are shut down.
Okay, now we're going to get back to something that you just hinted at that you really didn't want to get into, and I don't want you to force you into it, but it was almost, you must now be at the stage after you've seen what's happened to the world since 9/11, you must be at the stage where you are contemplating who the who's are.
Oh, it isn't about the who's, but the why's.
Okay, the whys then. Let's contemplate about the
whys. The who is this crew of people. I call them the crew.
Yes, that they are.
Yeah. So the why. Remember destruction of language, borders, and culture. And look at what's happening with this country and with the European Union. European Union is destruction of borders. And now when, with the U.S., if you bring in if you don't have a national language, for English press 1, if for Spanish press 2,
yes.
That is a destruction of the country, because you don't have national. It's all right to be bilingual, but you need to have a national language. Otherwise, you have friction and conflict within. And of course, the culture is very important. That's, been really turned on its ear recently. And of course, the borders. So what do we have going on in Europe now? It's a big stirring around, a big pot of whatever getting stirred in. That's it.
In 1960, when I went to Europe to try to find my father, who had abandoned our family, I ended up joining a British repertory company, and I loved being in England. It was so British, and it was just such a wonderful place to be for a year. And then I was in Spain, and then I was in Czechoslovakia, and I was in Hungary, and they were all so distinctive cultures. And Werner Herzog brought me to Vienna to honor me over the Garrison tapes, and I have a wonderful picture with Werner and wonderful words he said about me in the film. And it's all gone, Dr. Wood. I mean, I don't recognize English movies anymore. I don't recognize French movies anymore. I don't recognize Spanish movies anymore. And
it's a destruction.
But why did these countries, even the Germans, for God's sakes, the past master race, why have they allowed such an influx?
They don't realize it, or they get the wrong person in charge of the key. It leaves the door unlocked or something. But people can see what's gone on with our country. But I was trying to stay a little bit more what this show is about 9/11. You get people who do question the events of 9/11, but they're given someplace else to go to keep them occupied, so they don't look at the evidence. And I think that happens with about everything else. And they think that they're helping the cause or whatever, but they're actually not. If you think about those who are promoting that there were bombs in the building. Okay, so Bin Laden didn't instruct the Muslims to drive airplanes in the building. He instructed them to go put bombs in the building. Everything else is the same.
Absolutely.
You see, it's the same. It's the same thing. It just gives people a different lollipop. And from my looking at 9/11, Now, I didn't look into the JFK stuff, but easily I can see that, people who didn't like the lone gunman story, the grassy knoll. And that keeps them occupied and keeps them from looking further at evidence. And it's something that never gets proved or disproved. It's just a holding tank.
Now, Dr. Wood, are you invited and paid substantially to speak to groups as a result of people hearing about your book?
Nope. Instead, they get the truthers there, because they have a very well-funded advertising campaign and a very nice budget. I don't. I just have a few friends that help out here and there when they can.
The couple of times I saw your lectures, I believe one was in England. I'm trying to remember. I don't know if one was...
St. Anne's.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was spelled, but that's when I first wanted to talk to you and interview and get your book, and I'm sort of ashamed of myself that it wasn't until a month ago that I finally got your book, but I used to look at your site all the time. So are you just now earning a living from the sale of the book?
And doing some other odd jobs on the side. It's, I live poor. But it's something, if, like I said to my mom when I told her I need to get into doing this, that's in the introduction chapter of the book. She said, well, if you do that, you won't have a job. And I said, if I don't do it, nobody will.
Oh, my God.
And I said that years ago, over 10 years ago. Now, doesn't that come true now?
Oh, absolutely. And it looks worse, quite honestly, as we look to the future, which may not even be a future. I saw it then, and who am I? But somebody needs to do it, and who else is going to do it? And I felt like I was in probably the best position, because other people have families, they have kids going off to college, and who knows what. But I think they're more tied in, and I felt like it was easier for me to do it too. But there must be somewhere on the planet a multi-millionaire who is not too fond of the United States of America and knows the truth about, or somewhat of the truth about, what really happened at 9/11, because he or she looked at the facts. Why wouldn't someone contact you to help you? And the other thing is, have you ever thought of making a documentary about your book?
Various people have volunteered to, and they've even filmed some parts, and then they used them to do a hit piece on me.
Oh my God!
You just it goes on and on. What I've learned, I've learned quite a bit. Now let's talk about Jesse Ventura. Somebody gave him a copy of my book.
Right.
And he thought it was the greatest thing since sliced bread. He was talking about it and so forth. And then he got really beat up badly by the truthers. Well,
yes, he did. I remember. As a matter of fact, I've been trying to book Ventura for a year through his co-author and best friend, Dick Russell, who's been on my show a couple of times and is featured prominently in The Last Word in the Assassination. And Jesse keeps turning me down.
He's afraid to talk about this topic too, because either he has to lie or something else, or get if you're a politician, you can't do anything if everyone's against you. And that's one thing the truthers are trained for. They don't realize these are well-meaning people. They just get trained to recite these talking points and to hate anybody who has anything to do with Judy Woods. Let's go attack Judy Woods. And if I'm on a show, like, you'll get probably lots of emails or something after you, post my show, the show with me, that you've totally discredited yourself by having her on.
I must tell you, surprisingly, I put it up prominently on my Facebook page a couple of weeks ago. I have not received one negative comment, and just dozens of people anxious to listen to you because they probably can't.
Well, congratulations to them, because that identifies them as thinking people.
Well, anyway, the other thing that I wish to talk to you about is the kids that made that first anti-government 911 video, Loose Change.
Yeah.
What happened to them, and have you been in contact with them?
Oh, I met them in 2006, and they about spit on me when they met me. It was in person in New York. They were already being taught to hate me.
Why? I mean,
they were directed to. I mean, the people don't realize when you hear somebody, like, let's go back to elementary school. You hear rumors like so and so said such and such behind your back. You believe it. You believe it, and then you have a negative impression of them, and turns out they're saying the same thing to them about you. And people can easily be coerced that way. So it's so important to, see for yourself how many people out there repeat and repeat. Well, I heard her space beams theory has been, debunked.
Well, it was not the 911 kids. It was that documentary that seemed to burst on the scene, I think, through it being pushed by Alex Jones, that brought more people to question 911, even though they certainly might be.
But see, you want to get the low-hanging fruit before it falls off the tree and starts looking around on its own. So people who are starting to think about something, you want to grab them and funnel them into, it was bombs in the building. And because once they're in there, it takes about 5 years for them to get out of that.
Has Alex Jones ever contacted you about being
Jesse Ventura was on Alex Jones's show and said, "Alex, you got to read this book. Where Did the Towers Go?" And before you get that out, Alex had said, "I know," I'm trying to shut him up.
Oh my goodness gracious! Oh.
Yeah, I'm the most despised, whatever. He refers to me as the Space Beam Lady or Marvin the Martian. He's also called me.
Would it be possible for somebody like John Hutchison? I believe he lives in British Columbia, if I'm not mistaken.
He lives in Oregon now.
Oh, he does. Oh, I thought I don't know why I thought he was a Canadian. Maybe because he was so smart.
He got married to somebody in the U.S. and he decided he wanted to live there, and he's happy. He's having a good time.
Oh, good for John.
He deserves happiness. He really deserves happiness in his life.
Well, has John ever thought of some way that he could help get you in front of schools or in front of community organizations or into libraries where you could talk about your book? Dr. Wood, I can't thank you enough for being here. The 2 hours for me just flew by, and my heart breaks for you for the fact that you say you're living poor. But I must tell you, you are an absolute treasure. Tell us where folks can get your book before we say goodbye.
My website, wheredidthetowersgo.com, or on Amazon. On my site, it takes you to the various places you can get the book. Also, where you can find it in a library if you wanted to do that.
Well, Dr. Wood, thank you again very, very much. And for those folks who can take the truth, you are, again, a treasure for America. And the wonderful thing about America is it can create people like you and Jim Garrison and Thomas Paine and a whole bunch of others. Sadly, it creates the George Bushes of the world, too. Thank you so much for being here, all of you, and we'll talk to you some other time. Bye now.
Thank you again.
Oh, Dr. Wood, thank you very much.
You're my spark of nature's fire. You're my sweet, complete desire. A sunny, 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 sunny. I love you.